When my husband's mother looked across the table and said, "He's not one of us," something in me broke. But what my son said next, what he said without raising his voice or shedding a single tear, left the entire room stunned, including me. That moment is etched into my memory like a scar, a clean, quiet wound, sharp enough to draw blood, soft enough that nobody else saw it. We were sitting at a long oak dining table, surrounded by wine glasses that barely touched and smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. The table was dressed to impress: polished silver, expensive candles, plates that probably came from some high-end registry. But beneath all that glitter, I could feel the cold. I should have trusted my gut. I should have known better than to expect warmth from a family that had never fully welcomed me, or my son. My name is Zara. I'm 41, a mother, a wife, and, by marriage, a member of the Caldwell family. My husband Reed is everything his family pretends to be: kind, grounded, thoughtful. He's the reason I ever set foot in their world in the first place. I met him when Malik, my son, was 4. Reed fell in love with us both. He said we were his family from the start, and I believed him. The problem was, his family never did. They never said it outright, never told me to my face that I didn't belong. But they didn't have to. Sometimes silence screams louder than words. Sometimes it's in the way people barely make eye contact, or how they forget to include you in photos, or how they leave your child's name off the place cards. That night, it was dinner at Reed's mother's home, a formal celebration for his new job promotion, a family gathering. Everyone was invited, everyone was expected to attend, and everyone did, including us. Malik was 13, polite, soft-spoken, and always observant. He wore the navy button-up I'd ironed the night before and tried to comb his curls just the way Reed does. He looked so grown, so hopeful. He didn't say it, but I knew. He was trying to be liked, trying to be included. I told him it would be okay. I told myself the same thing, and for the first few minutes, it was fine. People made small talk. Trina, Reed's sister, complimented Malik's shoes, then immediately turned to her own son to say, "We'll get you better ones this weekend." Her version of conversation always came with a sting. Reed poured wine, tried to keep things light. He made a joke about corporate life. His dad chuckled politely. Vivian, his mother, watched everything like a queen overseeing a meal she'd lost interest in. Then the topic shifted to family, bloodlines. Someone made a joke about keeping things in the family. And Vivian, never one to miss a moment to slide a blade between the ribs with a smile, looked across the table at Malik and said, "Well, he's not really one of us anyway." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a joke. It was a statement. Sharp, deliberate, casual, like a wine stain she couldn't wait to wipe away. The words hung in the air. Reed froze mid-bite. Trina smirked. Her husband looked down at his plate. And me? I couldn't breathe. I looked at Malik. His fork hovered above his plate. He blinked slowly. His shoulders rose just enough to tell me he'd heard every word. And then he stood up. 13 years old, barely 5'2", but in that moment, he stood taller than anyone else at that table. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. He looked directly at Vivian and said something that would change everything, something I'd never forget. "Good, because I don't want to be part of you." It was calm, quiet, devastating. And just like that, the room fell into absolute silence. That was the moment everything changed, not just for Malik, not just for me, but for Reed, for his family, for the version of our lives I had accepted for too long. The dinner wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was framed as a family celebration, a toast to Reed's new role as regional director at his firm. It was the kind of milestone Vivian loved to claim credit for, even though she had nothing to do with it. The invitations were sent out in her usual style, proper, stiff, and slightly performative, the kind that says, "We're having a dinner and appearances matter. Dress accordingly." We came, of course, because Reed asked us to, because I still held on to the thin hope that if we kept showing up, they'd stop treating us like outsiders, that maybe effort would one day equal acceptance. I dressed in soft beige, subtle makeup, nothing flashy. Malik wore a button-down shirt that I'd stitched a loose seam on just that morning. He was nervous, but tried not to show it. On the ride over, he asked if he should call Vivian Grandma. I hesitated. Call her whatever feels right, I told him. He nodded. What if it doesn't feel like anything? I smiled gently. Then you don't have to call her anything at all. That dinner started the way so many of them did, nicely enough. Reed's younger sister, Trina, greeted us with a kiss on the cheek, all performative sweetness. Her eyes scanned me up and down, subtly checking what handbag I was carrying. Her husband made an offhand joke about big shoes to fill and slapped Reed on the back like they were in some old boys' club. Malik sat beside me, silent but observant, the same way he always was around them. We weren't there for 10 minutes before I felt the shift. Vivian barely acknowledged us. Not a hug, not a thank you for coming. Just a glance and a faint, you're here. She spent most of the evening talking about Trina's kids, what private school they got into, the fancy coding camp in Maine, the leadership conference they were invited to. Every sentence was a status update, a comparison. She never asked Malik a single question. He tried. He really did. At one point, he offered a quiet compliment on the table setting. Vivian didn't even look up. When he laughed at one of Reed's stories, Trina's husband gave him a glance that said, "Stay in your lane." It was subtle, but Malik caught it. He always catches everything. I could feel him starting to close off. His voice got quieter, his posture tighter. Dinner was served, and the topic turned to ancestry, something Vivian loved to bring up, family names, legacy. Our bloodline, she called it, as if it were a royal crest passed through silver spoons. That's when it happened. Trina was mid-sentence about a cousin's engagement, and Malik, just trying to be part of the moment, passed her the breadbasket. He did it quietly, respectfully. Vivian turned her eyes to him, and with that same clipped tone she always used when pretending to be polite, she said, "Well, he's not really one of us anyway." It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Her voice was clear, purposeful, like she wanted to make sure it landed. I felt my stomach turn. My face went hot. It wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed by her, but it was the first time she had directed that cruelty at my son, in front of everyone without a trace of hesitation. Malik froze, fork in hand, mid-motion. I could see the hurt ripple across his face like a crack forming on glass. It only lasted a second, but it was enough. Reed looked stunned. His mouth parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't form words. Trina busied herself with her wine glass, eyes averted. Her husband looked at his plate, chewing too slowly. No one said anything. And that silence? It was the loudest thing in the room. I reached under the table to squeeze Malik's knee, to anchor him, to pull him back to safety. But before I could even touch him, he stood up. He placed his napkin beside his plate with the kind of deliberate calm you don't expect from a teenager. Then he looked directly at Vivian, not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more powerful, clarity. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of what they thought, because my son, my sweet, quiet, observant son, was about to say the one thing I never had the courage to say myself. And I knew once he did, nothing would ever be the same again. Malik didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists or raise his voice or storm away from the table like a typical teenager might. Instead, he stood slowly, placed his napkin beside his untouched plate, and turned to face the one person who had spent years quietly undoing him. Vivian, Reed's mother, his grandmother, and the woman who had just confirmed what Malik had suspected for years, that no matter how well he behaved, how politely he spoke, how many times he showed up, he would never truly be one of them. "Good," he said, calm as stone, "because I don't want to be part of you." Silence swept over the room like a strong wind that blew all the fake smiles away. No one moved. Forks hung in midair. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Vivian stared at him like she didn't understand what she had just heard. Like the words were coming from a stranger and not the boy who had eaten her cooking, smiled at her door, said thank you every time he was offered something, just to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. But Malik wasn't uncomfortable anymore. He was done shrinking. "I don't want to be part of a family that makes people feel like garbage when they're trying their best," he continued. "I've been trying to make you like me since I was 6, and I'm done." His voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. He wasn't speaking to start a fight. He was speaking to tell the truth. I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, Not out of fear, but out of something else, something unfamiliar, something like pride and pain and release all crashing together. I looked at Reed. His hands were clenched on his lap. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was staring at Malik, watching him, really seeing him in a way I hadn't seen Reed do in a long time. Vivian let out a small, nervous laugh. "I didn't mean it like that, Malik." But he didn't flinch. He didn't let her off the hook. "You did. And even if you didn't, you said it like you did. You always do." Trina cleared her throat, clearly trying to interrupt or change the subject, but the moment was too thick, too undeniable. Malik turned toward Reed. "Dad, I know you love me, but you can't keep letting this happen." That sentence hung in the air like a hammer. Reed blinked. Something shifted behind his eyes, like Malik had cracked something open in him. He pushed his chair back and stood up. And then, in the clearest voice I'd ever heard from him, he said, "You're right." He turned to Vivian. "Mom, I've ignored this for too long, but Malik is my son, my family. And if that's a problem for anyone at this table, that says more about you than him." Vivian opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Reed wasn't finished. "I've been so afraid of rocking the boat that I let you all treat Zara and Malik like they were temporary, like they were on trial. I should have spoken up a long time ago, and I'm sorry." He didn't raise his voice either, but for the first time in years, he stood all the way up. In his marriage, in his fatherhood, in his manhood. The people around the table didn't know what to do with it. Trina looked down. Her husband cleared his throat and said, "Well, I think dinner's probably over." And that was the moment I knew we were free. Not because anyone apologized, not because the night ended in hugs and forgiveness, but because my son had said what needed to be said, and Reed, finally, had followed. We didn't need validation after that, we needed peace. Malik looked at me and asked, "Can we go now?" I nodded. "Yeah, let's go." We left the table. We left the house. And in a much deeper, more permanent way, we left the idea that we ever had to prove ourselves to people who were never willing to see us in the first place. We didn't slam the door. We didn't raise our voices. We just walked out. Me, Malik, Reed, close behind. No one tried to stop us. No one called after us. There was no apology, no awkward attempt at saving face. It was like the room had collapsed into itself under the weight of the truth that had finally been spoken, the kind of truth that lingers in the air long after the words are gone. I remember the sound of Malik's shoes on the tiled floor, slow and certain. I remember reaching for his hand as we stepped outside, and how tightly he gripped mine, not in fear, but in finality, like something had snapped inside him that would never reattach the same way again. Reed caught up to us just as we reached the car. He didn't say anything right away, just stood beside us, breathing like someone who had finally come up for air after years underwater. "I should have said something earlier," he said quietly. I turned to him, exhausted and raw. "Why didn't you?" He looked at Malik first, then at me. Because I thought keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. But I realize now, peace without truth isn't peace. It's control. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because for years that's what I'd done too. I'd played along. I'd smiled politely. I'd softened myself around Reed's family, telling myself I was doing it for Malik. But really, I was doing it to avoid rocking a boat I never should have been sitting in. In the car, Malik was quiet. I asked if he was okay. "Yeah," he said, staring out the window. "I'm just done pretending they're better than us." And that was the moment it all crystallized, that this wasn't just about a dinner. It wasn't just about a comment. This was about dignity, about being tired of showing up where you're not wanted, about drawing a line that should have been drawn long ago. That night, we didn't talk much after we got home. We put on pajamas. Malik watched a rerun of his favorite show. I made tea and sat beside him on the couch like I used to when he was little. Reed came out of the bedroom later with 2 blankets and sat on the floor, quietly leaning against the coffee table. Not as a guest, not as a man stuck between 2 worlds, but as a husband and father finally choosing this world, our world. The next morning, Reed sent his mother a message. Not angry, not bitter, just clear. Until you can respect my wife and son as family, we won't be attending anything else. We deserve better." He didn't ask me if he should, just did it. She didn't reply. But the silence was a relief this time, not something to tiptoe around, but something that confirmed we'd finally set a boundary loud enough to be heard. In the days that followed, something changed between me and Malik. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been too stuffy for too long. He walked a little taller. He smiled more easily. He didn't ask if we were going to the next family barbecue, and I didn't lie and say maybe. I knew we weren't, because now we were building something different. Not perfect, not polished, but real. I used to think family was about bloodlines, about who accepts you at their table. But that dinner showed me something else. Family is who stands when it's hard, who speaks when it's risky, who chooses you even when it's inconvenient. That night, my son spoke truth with a clarity I didn't know he had, and my husband followed him. And I finally stopped waiting for permission to be enough. We didn't lose a family that night. We found ours. And maybe the most powerful moment wasn't when Malik stood up and spoke. Maybe it was when we walked out together. Quiet, united, unapologetic, and free. We didn't talk about that dinner right away. The next morning, I made breakfast like usual. Scrambled eggs, toast, a little fruit on the side. Malik came into the kitchen still in his pajamas, hair wild from sleep. He sat down, thanked me, and started eating without a word about what happened the night before. But something was different. There was a calm about him, a confidence that wasn't there before. It wasn't loud or cocky, it was subtle, a kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to shrink yourself to be tolerated. Reed joined us a few minutes later, still in his t-shirt, coffee in hand. The three of us sat together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the air was light, not heavy with tension or unsaid things, just light. That's when I knew. Something real had shifted, and it wasn't just about that night or that house or that table. It was about finally refusing to sit in places where love was conditional. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping quiet was the noble thing to do, that if I smiled enough, stayed soft enough, made enough effort, maybe Reed's family would eventually let go of their coldness toward Malik. I told myself it was about being the bigger person. But really, I was asking my son to carry the weight of other people's rejection, and I didn't even realize it. That dinner made it clear. I wasn't protecting him. I was prolonging his exposure to a kind of slow, constant erosion, one that tells you you're not enough, not because of anything you've done, but because of who you are. And he knew. He always knew. Kids see everything. And Malik, my son, saw far more than he ever should have had to. But that night, when he stood up and spoke those words, "Good, because I don't want to be part of you," he taught me something. He taught me that boundaries are not about bitterness. They're about dignity. He showed me that sometimes strength isn't in staying seated to keep the peace, but in standing up to protect your self-worth. And Reed, he changed too. He spent the days after that dinner reflecting, quietly but deeply. He apologized to both of us, not just for that night, but for every time he stayed silent while we were being diminished in subtle, dismissive ways. "I didn't know how much I was asking you to endure," he said, "and I didn't know how much I was asking Malik to pretend." Since then, he's been different, more intentional. When people from his side of the family reach out, he doesn't brush over things anymore. He sets boundaries. He says no when he needs to. He no longer expects us to show up just to keep appearances. As for Vivian, we haven't heard from her. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't follow up with an apology, but that's okay. Some people don't come around when you set boundaries. That doesn't mean the boundaries were wrong. It just means they were never really coming around to begin with. Trina sent a holiday card this year with a generic best wishes and a photo of her kids. We didn't send one back. We celebrated at home with just the three of us. Reed made his famous garlic rosemary chicken. Malik made cookies from scratch. We played games and watched movies and laughed from deep in our bellies. And you know what? It was more family than I've ever felt sitting at a crowded table with people who only ever saw us as guests in their bloodline. Because what I've learned is this: family isn't about who shares your last name. It's about who shares your table, your truth, and your love. It's about who chooses you, not out of duty, but out of respect. It's about who makes you feel like you belong, even when you're not at your best, especially then. Malik doesn't ask about them anymore. He doesn't bring up the dinner, or the comment, or the silence that followed. But he holds his head higher now. He's freer. And that matters more than reconciliation ever could. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt like an outsider in someone else's story, I hope you remember this. You don't need to beg to be loved. You don't need to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. And when your truth finally comes out, don't apologize for it. Let it stand. Let it echo. Let it free you. Because sometimes, the moment you stop asking for a seat at the table, you realize you were never meant to sit there in the first place. And that realization, that's the beginning of something much better. Some tables were never meant for you to sit at. And some families aren't defined by blood, but by the love and truth you build together. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt out of place, silenced, or like you had to fight just to be seen, you are not alone. Share your story in the comments. I read everyone, and you never know who might find comfort in your words. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it. Like it if it made you feel something. Subscribe to the channel for more real, raw, and honest stories that give voice to what we often keep inside. Thank you for being here. Stay honest, stay whole, and never forget, you don't need their acceptance to be worthy of your truth.